1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam, DFS fam? Welcome back to the DFS Lab. I'm your host, JM to Win, here with my man, KTM 128. Keegan, how's life?
Life is great. I'm like abnormally excited to build this slate specifically.
Nice. Yeah, this is actually so I'm not playing this week because I'm in Oregon all week. And the only reason I can't, literally can't leave is because I told you this, but my parents are in town. We're doing like a big second Christmas thing. My younger sister, her husband, their kids are in town. And I was literally like, by Wednesday, I was like, man, can I squeeze in like a quick flight to Oakland to enter rosters? Because I love this week.
Yeah.
Quick story. I was gonna tell Abby about the YouTube comments story, and then I was like, man, I better not, because Abby would go on the warpath. She still thinks you're 3 years old. So like Abby would have a fit if I told her this story. She would not think it's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so you asked me before the show, you said one of the things that you wanted to do on this one was we mostly focused on large field builds or like mid-sized field builds, right? Like the sort of 10K entry stuff. You said last week you kind of went for like the $50 contest with like the 300 to 500 entry stuff, and we wanted to build a roster today around that. I really like that, and I also really like talking about that on Saturday, because the approach to a roster like this is so different. Like a 300, 500 entry, even 1,000 entry contest is so different from the approach to a roster for a 10,000 entry tournament. And a 10,000 entry tournament or larger, you're wanting to expand your player pool. And so talking on like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we kind of get to be a little bit more theoretical about how we would approach large field contests. And then turning the page over to this on a Saturday allows us to kind of focus on who are we seeing as the sharper plays on the slate. One of the things that we talked about before the show was I love this discussion because this is where I've made most of my DFS money, is playing these smaller field contests. And part of my edge is that most people play these incorrectly. So we don't want to give away too much for free, I guess. This is stuff that I talk about in Inner Circle on the site. But yeah, it's fun to kind of build one of these smaller field builds and really talk about why we would make the decisions we would make on these types of builds. So as always, if you're new here, the concept of this show, I've been playing DFS for 9 years, had a lot of success. Keegan's been playing DFS for 1 year, has picked up a lot really quickly. But this allows us to have the kind of show where Keegan's asking the kinds of questions that most non-professional DFS players are asking about rosters. And so with kind of like, you're kind of on like that second or third layer of how to handle DFS and really play DFS instead of just picking players. But you get to kind of ask the same questions that other OWS members are asking, that other players are asking, and we get to kind of build a roster in that way instead of two experts building a roster together. With that, Keegan, any thoughts on where you want to start this build, or any thoughts on like how you would want to approach a build like this?
Yeah. So last week, this was my first time like playing one of those smaller field tournaments. And the mindset that I had was maybe I can build this a little more chalky than a larger field tournament. And maybe I was wrong there, but I kind of would go into the same, had we not like had a discussion or a conversation, I'd probably go into this with the same mindset, having a little more chalk on this roster.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily distinguish things in terms of like chalk versus non-chalk, popular plays versus non-popular plays on smaller field. What I am mostly concerned with is how high is the floor that I'm building. And so one of the reasons why that's important is because like a few weeks ago when I finished third place in the Game Changer, which is the 1,500 buy-in, like usually around 350 entries, 100K to first place. And so the way you're building for that is like, you want that first place finish because that's where most of the money is, but it's also 50K to second, 30K to third, I think 20K to fourth. So like the goal is to have a roster that's up there, but also you don't want to be firing in bullets at whether it's 1,500 or 50 or like whatever your bankroll supports, where you're like, okay, this is a higher buy-in for me, but it's a smaller field, right? You don't want to be firing in bullets like that are having no chance at the money when you miss, right? And so typically one of the things that we talk about a lot is that if you keep having rosters, generally in tournament play, if you keep having rosters that are consistently finishing on the cut line where you're like barely not cashing or barely cashing, you're probably playing DFS wrong, because you want to be willing to have those rosters that finish what we say in this in the your little bubble in the standings on the phone, right? All the way to the right or all the way to the left. Like if you're finishing all the way to the left, but it's a roster that you're like, yeah, this could score 200 points, then you're probably doing something right, because you were so far off of what everybody else is doing that you're way over here. But I had 4 different times this year where I bubbled the game changer. 4 different times where I was like 0.5 points to 3 points out of the money. And each of those times I looked at it and I was like, no, I'm still playing well, right? And so it's because I assessed it like, oh, am I playing like too close to what everybody else is doing? Because like there's no reason to throw away your money on like really risky bets, right? And so the roster that I had a few weeks ago that finished third, it had James Cook on it, and James Cook scored 4.5 points, I think it was, or 2.5 points, right? And it still finished in third place because all the rest of my pieces, even the ones that didn't go for huge games, like they weren't going to kill me. And so there's that component. Ideally, like the best weeks to play these small fields, which like for me, this is what, like, I guess maybe 70% of my bankroll each week is on these smaller field contests. So I play them regardless, but the best weeks to play them, the most plus EV weeks, are typically going to be when you're looking at the slate and you're like, okay, these are the highest probability spots. And then you're like, oh, these are not the way, this is not the way that the field is playing things, right? Because the popular, like if you look at ownership projections, whatever is popular is going to be more popular in single entry and small field stuff. Like a guy who's projected at 20% owned might be 35% owned in smaller field stuff. So that's awesome. The weeks where you're like, oh, this is going to be popular, and it's not the way that I'm seeing things is like the highest probability way. What we often see there is like the Keenan Allen's. He's a guy I always use as an example, right? Who hasn't gone for even 4x his salary in over 2 years. But now at this point, it's like 46 of his last 50 games, he's gone for double-digit points. So people, they feel comfortable clicking that button because they're like, okay, Keenan Allen's never going to kill me, but he's never going to get you that ceiling, right? So you still got to like embrace that ceiling. And you can look at ownership projections a little bit more and be like, okay, where can I leap over people? If Keenan Allen's 30% owned, then it's like, okay, Keenan Allen's not going to score more than like 23, 24 points in most of his great games. So where can I go that I can like potentially get a 30-pointer and leap above everybody? Or where can I get a 20-pointer for like 2K less in salary and have a totally different salary structure? All that said, I still want to play the best plays in smaller field, right? And so the best plays are not, the chalk is not always the best plays, but like the week when I had a big week, I was on Jared Goff and the Lions offense that was popular that week, right? And so you can be on some popular plays. So yeah, you can have more willingness to be on chalk, but I don't go out of my way to play chalk. I mostly go out of my way to play higher probability bets. And so I think that, like, I don't know, you have any questions on the way I laid that out? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, not necessarily sacrifice ceiling, but do a little more for the floor than usual.
Yeah, and it's like this. So mathematically, I forget the exact numbers on it, but it was like to get a 9-leg parlay correct, where in DFS we basically need 75th percentile outcome. So something that they would hit 75% of the time. And to get a 9-leg parlay right at 75th percentile outcomes is like 1 out of every 264,000 times you would get it right, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you're just trying to get, if you're trying to beat 264,000 rosters in the Millie Maker, then you have more willingness to be like, let me take some crazy bets. But if you're only trying to beat 300 rosters, it's like, how do I turn the math more and more in my favor? And the way you do that is by getting guys who are going to hit that's like that 4x score more than 75% of the time. Or guys who, if this guy hits, this guy's also hitting, right? Whether it's like we talked about this week that Hurts can hit without his wideouts, but if his wideouts hits, Hurts is hitting, right? So if you're playing a Devontae Smith or an AJ Brown, Hurts is going to be inactive now. But in that scenario, if you're playing one of those guys, like, okay, now I also play Hurts because if I'm getting this bet right, I'm also getting Hurts right. If I'm getting Kelsey right, I'm also getting Mahomes right. So you might as well pair them. And so it's like, how do you just keep turning the math in your favor? And most people don't think of it that way. They're still thinking of like picking players, right? And so one of the clearest ways to turn the math in your favor is like, who is the highest probability guys to get to these 4x scores? And then also, if these guys miss, who are then you might have a pool of like 20, 25 players where you're like, okay, these are the highest probability guys to go for these 4x scores. And then it's like, among these guys, who's least likely to kill me if they miss? And then you kind of keep putting in, because again, everything's just building up sample sizes. But if you keep putting in rosters like that week in and week out in these types of contests, like you're going to blow away the field over time, which is why I love these contests so much. I call them bankroll builders, because you can build these rosters that are going to finish in the money a little bit more often. Somewhat humorously, I say that like 10 of my 11 weeks in the Game Changer this year, I finished out of the money. And then I had 1 week where I finished third place that like more than made up for all of that. But 4 of those 10 weeks where I missed, it was like right there on the cut line too, right? So over time, you build these rosters that are going to actually make you money even when you're not hitting those high-end finishes. And you do that by saying like, I don't need to be 200,000 rosters, so I don't need to be as like broad reaching. I need to be 300 or 400 rosters. So how do I play the math in terms of that? So yeah, basically like we had our quarterback list yesterday where we were like, there's really only a few guys we feel super comfortable with. And so we wouldn't go outside that list, and I wouldn't even worry too much about ownership on those guys, because as we've seen this week going through our rosters, we can build salary structures that are really different from what everybody else has. Or we can I wouldn't mind having like a roster in a small field tournament where the cumulative ownership is like 170%. You add it all up across all 9 guys, it comes up to 170%. As long as I'm like, yeah, but nobody else has like these 3 high price guys together, or nobody else has like a total mid-range roster, or however it might be. Right. And so, yeah, it's basically like, and that's why I like all these practice builds, why I build 70, 80 rosters throughout the week, even if I don't put in 2/3 of them. Right. Because it's like building all these rosters helps me get a sense of who are the sharpest guys for this narrowest pool for these smaller field contests. So with that, I'll throw it over to you. Any thoughts on where you want to start on this roster?
Yeah, absolutely. With all that being said, it's kind of made me kind of go the opposite way from which I went last week. And I guess I didn't really say that right when I at first said it. I said the chalkiest, but in reality, I kind of did do what you said, but I also did it with high salary, like especially at quarterback. I went Patrick Mahomes just because I was like, okay, look at his game log. He's at least going to get me like 25 points.
Yeah.
And I like didn't take into consideration who else could get that but is cheaper. And I think that might have been what hurt me in these smaller tournaments. So
yeah, and you can, and there's 2 things here too, right? Like you've done this once, and so you have a sample size of 1, right? Like I've been doing this for so long that when I missed in the Game Changer 10 times in a row, I was still like, I wasn't like, oh, am I playing poorly, right? I was able to look at it and be like, okay, like top 20% cash, right? So 1 out of every 5 rosters should finish in the money, and I had 10 that didn't. But it's like, okay, these are all still well-built rosters, and so you don't want to get swayed by the results, because the more we can think about like, okay, this is just like another little piece of sample size in the bucket, and as long as it's a roster that would make me money if we could play out this slate 100 times, then like that's going to make, I keep doing that week in and week out, I'm going to make money. But also, yeah, like one of the things that we can end up doing on these rosters is getting so fixated on like one position, right? So it's like, okay, Mahomes, and then you end up having to sacrifice salary in other places, right? So you end up with like 3 pieces on the roster that are lower probability in order to fit in this high probability guy. So there are times where like, yeah, where I'm playing Fields or Mahomes or one of these higher priced guys in these tighter contests. If there's like this week, we really like Greg Dortch. This week, we really like DJ Chark. So there are savings available, right? And you could be like, okay, like if I put these 2 guys in, I do have the salary flexibility to go up to a Mahomes if I want, or I can, and there's a lot more mixing and matching on these rosters. We might do like we're already 14 minutes in. We might do like a 40-minute show today just to kind of show how we would kind of poke around on one of these and like really get down to a roster we feel comfortable with. Because, I'll sometimes spend 2 hours on one build here and not talking out loud, right? So I'm like just kind of sitting there, headphones on, like poking around on like all the different ways I can piece things together. So, but that's like a very key thing to think about, is you don't want to get fixated on this one guy who's high probability, but then that forces like 3 other spots to be lower probability. I would almost say like for this roster for this week, why don't we throw in, if you're comfortable with Dortch and Chark on this type of build, why don't we throw them in? And then we have like a clearer sense of where we need to take on, like, because there's typically going to be like 1 or 2 spots on a roster where you do have to take on a little bit more risk to fit everything else. But if we have Dortch and Chark, we might not need to do that, especially if we think that most of these guys above 7,200 won't hit this week. And on this roster, you know what else I want to do? I want no Etienne. I want no Zay. I want no Ingram. I want no Kirk. And the thinking, I want no Christian McCaffrey. The thinking is these guys are going to be popular because we always want to, like, one of the things I like about these smaller field contests is it's so much easier to work through the strategy because you know what people are going to do, right? These guys are going to be popular. And as we've talked about, there's legitimate risk that I'll say it like this. How often do people think like, oh, this is a smash spot, it can't miss, and then the players still miss, right? So even if the Jags play the full game, there's a 75% chance that these guys don't hit, right? And that everybody is wrong on these Jags pieces at high ownership. And then there's the added chance that they're going to play 3 series, 5 series, keep this team in rhythm, and then get them off the field to rest them up for this important week 18 matchup, because week 17 literally means nothing to the Jags. And so the fact that they're going to be popular and that even if I loved these guys this week, I would be like, well, what would make me the most money over time would be already popular guys. You can always be like, are they as good as everybody thinks they are? Maybe I'm gaining an edge not playing them. And then on top of that, there's this risk that people aren't considering where it's like, oh, maybe they only play half the game. If they play the full game, there's still a chance, a normal sized chance that all these people are wrong on the Jags pieces. And the only way that it really hurts us is if Lawrence puts up like a 36 pointer, or Zay puts up a 35 pointer, or Ingram puts up a 30 pointer. Like if that happens and it's like, okay, we weren't going to win this week on our smaller field builds, but we still have some of them in large field play can make up for it. But yeah, like this is the sort of roster where I'm going to be like, okay, one of my edges this week is not playing these guys because maybe 50, 60% of the rosters get hurt because these guys only play half the game. And now we're only competing against like less than half the field. So that's how I would start like any small field roster this week is like, be willing to go to, I would have Dortch on any of them myself. Doesn't mean that if you're watching this that you would have to. If you're curious why, you can check out OWS for our thoughts on that. I would have Chark on my main build and then try to like force myself to not have him on all of my small field rosters so that, like we talked about, if he misses, I still have pathways to some of these other rosters winning, but I feel really comfortable with it. And so like for a main build, I would be like Dortch, Chark, no Jags, and that would be my starting point, and then figure out where I could go from there. So with that, any thoughts on quarterback or a different direction you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I had a few quarterbacks in mind. Obviously, I mean, it's the ones that we talk about like every day: Patrick Mahomes, Justin Fields, Jared Goff, Minshew. Because I mean, Hurts is doubtful, so we could go that route. Maybe he does go off again. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would be totally fine with any of those 4 in smaller field. Minshew is like, the order for me would probably go Goff, Mahomes, Fields, Minshew. But that doesn't necessarily mean that my main build would have Goff. It's just that we have how are the Lions going to try to win this game? They're going to pass the ball a lot. Can the Bears threaten the Lions enough for them to keep passing deep into the game? Probably. And what I mean by that isn't necessarily just can the Lions score the points to make it look close on the scoreboard, but we've seen games where like Kansas City was up 27-0 against the Broncos, and then the Broncos came back and made it competitive, right? The Lions are not going with Justin Fields on the other side. The Lions aren't going to take a 10-point lead and then be like, all right, let's shut things down and run the ball, right? They're going to stay aggressive pretty deep into this game. And so Jared Goff has so few question marks in terms of how they're going to attack here. The only question there is he doesn't run the ball, right? So if the passing touchdowns go, this is what I like to do on these smaller field builds is like, what are the pros? What are the cons? What are the risks? What are the, like, how likely are things to happen? The risk here is that he throws for 275 yards instead of 300, doesn't get the bonus, which the bonus is worth almost a full touchdown on DraftKings, right? Almost a full passing touchdown. And then the touchdowns come on the ground instead of through the air. We can't even necessarily take advantage of that because it could be DeAndre Swift getting the yards, Jackson getting some of the yards, Jamal Williams getting 37 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. So it's like, yeah, there's some risk on Goff. And then the risk on Minshew is, well, I'll say it like this. I feel I've spent a lot of time studying the Eagles this year because they've been an important team to know. And I feel like I'm really in sync with how Nick Sirianni views things. And I expect them to come out in this game and be aggressive, attack through the air. But we've also seen games, the game against Houston, they threw the ball 13 times on their first drive. And then I think Hurts finished with 28 pass attempts, right? So like if they get a big lead, they're going to be like, okay, cool. Like now let's turn to the run. So I expect Minshew to get a lot of passing attempts early on. His over under for pass attempts on sports books is 32.5, right? So he could end up with like 33 pass attempts because they're dominating this game, or 28 pass attempts, 29 pass attempts. And that only leads to him getting 250 yards and 1 or 2 touchdowns himself, right? So I would feel more comfortable with Goff. There are fewer ways for him to fail, but I really like Minshew on tighter builds as well. So I would be fine going any direction on this one. What I would probably do if we're talking like main build, like if you're saying, hey, I'm going to play like 2 rosters this week in $50 tournaments, and this is my main one, like I would go Goff. But then if I were building like 6 or 7 smaller field things, I would build like around Minshew and maybe build a Mahomes and Fields one as well.
Cool. Let's do Goff. I was like leaning towards Goff even before we started this show, but
nice. And then it's a weird week at running back because it's like there are a lot of question marks, right? If we're not playing Etienne on this roster, McKinnon has a broad range of outcomes with a high ceiling. Miles Sanders has a broad range of outcomes with a high ceiling. Dalvin Cook has a broad range of outcomes, right? Like James Conner, now they've got David Blau starting. He has a broad range of outcomes. And then if we go down to these cheaper guys, like the low 5K guys, they all have broad ranges of outcomes. So this isn't a week where we're getting as much certainty at running back as we can typically target. So with that, we kind of, we recognize that our running back decisions are going to influence our salary on the rest of our rosters. So that means that we could start at wide receiver or tight end and then come back to running back, or we could pick our running backs and let that kind of influence what we do elsewhere. Your call on what we do there.
I kind of have a feeling of maybe like double stacking here, maybe putting in Swift and Chark and then going and picking everything else and then coming back last for maybe we can get a more expensive running back at that point.
Yeah. And so a thought here, go ahead and throw in Swift and I'll talk about this, is that one of the best ways to play the tight end position, you'll hear sharp tournament players talk about this all the time, is they're like, okay, I have these 3 tight ends that I like, and then the rest of my tight ends are just going to be attached to whatever offense I'm playing. Like that's a very easy way to fill the tight end position because it's so high variance that you can just be like, okay, if this offense scores, if I'm betting on this offense scoring a bunch of points, then maybe this guy trips into 2 touchdowns and I benefit, right? Or 1 touchdown and I benefit. So we just talked about running back being, usually running back is where we're like, especially on these smaller field contests, it's like, where is the highest floor and highest ceiling? And we just lock in high probability stuff at running back. And we just talked about how this is not a week like that. So in other words, we described the running back position being more like the tight end position this week. And so it's a great place to be like, well, here's a pass catching back attached to the offense we're already betting on. And so it kind of, like it lowers the number of things we need to get right, even though running back is not super predictable this week. We have now kind of looped this into the bets we're already making on this roster. And so it's a really sharp way to play things on a roster like this, on a week like this in particular, because it gives us fewer things we need to get right. Now, if the Lions score 35 points, if they score 5 touchdowns, we've got a pretty good shot at like picking up multiples of those touchdowns from these pieces.
Okay. So all that being said, who are like the tight ends you're looking at?
Tight ends I'm looking at. So we've got Debo's going to be out, right? So we know that Kittle is averaging over 22 points per game in the games that Debo misses. Or is limited. It's like an 8-game sample size we have now where he's averaging over 22 points per game. That's pretty high probability. TJ Hawkinson, broad range of outcomes. So even though you like him this week, he's a guy that I would be playing in some large field stuff. I would personally be avoiding him on a tighter build like this. Cool. Sometimes those decisions come back to bite me though, right? Like Hawkinson, we've seen it. He can put up 40, but he just put up 40. And we've also seen him put up 10 to 12 to 15 in all his other games with the Vikings. So he's the kind of guy that I would probably stay away from on this build. Another thing to think about too is Justin Jefferson is going to be popular, and because people are kind of catching on to like how thin the high priced guys are this week, right? Tyreek Hill has Teddy Bridgewater against the Patriots. Devontae Adams has Jarrett Stidham against the 49ers. AJ Brown has Gardner Minshew in a game that the Eagles will likely control. Obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown will be popular, but we're not going to have him with already having Swift and Chark. People are going to be playing McCaffrey. We've already talked about the potential holes there, but then these other high-priced running backs, people will really be off of them. And so that's going to kind of force people onto Jefferson. And then Jefferson's in this really tough matchup, but he also hit for a huge game last time. He's always capable of hitting for a huge game in tough matchups. So I say that to say he's kind of a key decision point in smaller field play. I would expect him to be 25 to 30% owned in small field play, which means if he goes for 35 points, we're going to have a really hard time getting first place and maybe even getting into the money without him. At the same time, we can also say, yeah, but Jefferson, like, let's look through his game logs real quickly. And I guess pull Jefferson up on there as well. But 3 straight weeks of 30 plus points, but week 13 against the Jets, 18.6, week 11 against Dallas, 6.3, week 8 against Arizona, 15.8, week 6 against Miami, 19.7, week 3 against Detroit, randomly 4.4, week 2 against Philadelphia, 10.8. One of the things to note here outside of the Detroit game, Philadelphia, excellent against wide receivers. Miami, not excellent against wide receivers, but they're capable of it. Arizona, they're banged up now, but excellent against wide receivers through the first half of the season. Dallas, kind of up and down against wide receivers, but really good pieces in their secondary. The Jets, lights out against wide receivers. Now he's facing the Packers, who are really good against wide receivers. So he could put up another one of these 15-pointers, and if that happens, then we have this huge edge and like leaping over everybody who spent $9,500 on a guy who scored 15 points. Yeah. So we kind of have to decide at some point, and I would want to, if I'm not seeing pieces that, like if there were pieces where we're like, I'm super confident on this guy, I wouldn't worry about Jefferson. But we're kind of dealing with uncertainty across the board at this point. And so one of the things I would want to do here is like not allow the roster to make my Jefferson decision for me, but proactively be like, okay, am I playing Jefferson here or not? Because if we play Jefferson, we can fit him, right? We've got savings at defense and we can find savings elsewhere, maybe at tight end, et cetera. But before I play my tight end, I would want to say, okay, at this point, Jefferson's the next key decision point. I don't want the roster to decide that for me because the roster is going to be full of some question marks this week anyway. So like, I'm going to make this decision right now and then let that dictate the rest of my roster. So no wrong answer here, right? Like I said, Jefferson can score 35 plus. This is also very clearly a week in which Jefferson could score 15 to 18 again. So we just take a stand and then roll with whatever happens. What do you want to do on this particular roster, Jefferson or no Jefferson?
I really like Kittle, and I'm assuming if we grab any of these higher tight ends, we're just not going to grab Jefferson. So I'm really feeling like, when we looked at that game log as well, it really did show me that those harder defenses, I mean, they can't fully shut him down, but they limit the amount of fantasy points he can get. Yeah,
I mean, they're certainly capable of it. Like that's way more within his range of outcomes than people probably give it credit for this week. And so, yeah, I mean, and we could potentially fit in Kittle and Jefferson, but I just think like once we fit in Kittle, it makes it much tougher. And so I want to make that Jefferson decision first. So yeah, I am totally fine going. Like if I were playing this roster this week, right now, this is basically the typical starting point I would probably have in smaller field this week. I would be totally comfortable going Kittle and choosing to go like proactively choosing, okay, no Jefferson on this roster. And then the next thing I would want to think is if I'm not playing Jefferson, do I think that this, like Vegas is implying this to be 25 to 22 points, right? Like that might mean that nobody on the Vikings hits at their price tags. But do I think that that's how this game plays out? Or do I want to leverage the fact that I'm not playing Jefferson by instead playing Dalvin Cook and saying maybe I get the points through Dalvin Cook? You could even say this is where we would say like, okay, I'm going to take on like one higher risk piece. You could play KJ Osborne and be like, if the Vikings are, if the Packers are shutting down Justin Jefferson, does that mean KJ Osborne is getting some points here? So yeah, look at his game logs. It's like a bunch of duds. And then
he went crazy like 2 weeks
and then, ago. Yeah, a 14-pointer and a 34-pointer. 34-pointer in the first round of the best ball playoffs, no less. So
that game was awesome though. That Vikings Colts game.
That was that big. You were texting me during that game.
Yeah,
that's the what is this at the bottom? We got Twitter feeds with Levitan and Pat Mayo getting their faces in there on your Google ads. Good for them. Shout out to old friends of OWS. Okay, so we could leverage the get Adam off my screen. We could close out KJ's thing. We could leverage this with going with another Vikings piece, or we could just say, well, I don't really think, and it's not like, what do we think, but what do we want to predict on this roster? On this roster, do we want to say, maybe this game just doesn't go nuts? Most Packers games don't go nuts. Or do we want to try to leverage the no Jefferson further by going Dalvin or KJ Osborne instead of Jefferson?
I'm totally okay with going Dalvin, not necessarily KJ Osborne. I just
cool. Yeah, no, I mean, there's literally no need to take on that type of play. Another thing I always try to think about is, if Osborne hits, how likely is that to burn me in this contest, right? He's going to be 2% owned in a smaller field contest or lower. And so if he hits, it's not going to kill me. And if he hits, the chance of him hitting like a monster game, like another 34-pointer, are so low, right? If he hits, it's probably like 14 points, 17 points. So then I can be like, well, he's going to be, and these are all the questions I ask myself on these types of rosters from like a strategy standpoint. It's like, okay, so he's not going to kill me, and so I don't need to worry about that. And Dalvin, what's cool about the Dalvin play is, I talk about it like this. If we're removing the idea of trying to predict what's going to happen, and we're instead saying, like, how do I build a roster that's likeliest to win? Right now, this Dalvin button is highlighted for us. It doesn't mean we have to play it, but because we're not playing Jefferson, we proactively chose to not play Jefferson. It's like this big highlight mark is on this Dalvin play. And so it's like, this is a sharp way to play this roster. And so you can just say, okay, I'm not predicting Dalvin has a huge game. If he goes for 14 points, I'm not sitting there like, why did I think he was going to score 28, right? You're just like, you know that he can score 28, and you know that this strategy makes a lot of sense. You're going to be taking away points from Jefferson, hopefully hurting those Jefferson rosters. Packers run defense is awful. We've seen a lot of teams bias their attack really heavily toward the run against. In fact, I think the Packers are facing the third. Let me actually look this up real quickly. I think they're facing the third lowest. Yeah. Packers are facing the third lowest opponent pass play rate in the NFL this year. So take all 32 teams, only 2 teams are being attacked on the ground more at a higher rate than the Packers. So with that, I think that this Dalvin play is really interesting. And we have a defense left to play and have 6,300 left per spot. So like, yeah, it makes sense to have spent that salary there. I guess might as well go defense next. Are you thinking, and any of these are right answers, are you thinking 49ers, Patriots, or Eagles?
Yeah, I mean, the Eagles are great. Do you want to leave the defense for last just to see if we can pull the Eagles, but not necessarily have to like stretch for them?
Yeah, well, and I would put them in and just have that flexibility to know, like, okay, I'm putting this in as a placeholder, because what we're going to see is, like, we're not that interested. You and I haven't been super interested on this show this week in spending more than 7,200, and we have 7,450 per player, right? So like we're already going to be forced to probably move off of DeAndre Swift and pay up a little bit, just because we don't really want to spend this salary, you know? So the Eagles defense kind of, another thing we can also consider here is we could be like, okay, if the Eagles are leaving us this much salary, maybe we go 49ers and get up to Justin Fields, right? And kind of just play this totally differently, where we say, like, Swift and Chark score touchdowns, but Goff doesn't throw 4 touchdowns himself, right? He throws maybe 2 touchdowns. Swift gets 1 on the ground. Chark gets 1 through the air, and Fields like goes nuclear on the ground. Goff puts up 24 points. Fields puts up 35 to 40, and we gain that edge. So I like the salary flexibility that we have here. And we can just kind of keep all of that in the backs of our minds now. Like, we can move off the Eagles. We can switch off Goff, because we're going to have to switch off somewhere if we're not paying more than 7,200 for any pieces. The other option is, we can go Amon-Ra St. Brown and take out Swift, and then kind of see what we have at salary to work with there. But yeah, a lot of different ways that we can kind of play around with things at this point.
So what are the odds of like all of them hitting? Like, I've seen this in an Eagles game. I don't even remember what week it was, but actually it was also in a Bengals game too. Like, somebody had Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Boyd. All of them hit. What are the odds of that happening this game?
So the odds are low, but one of the things to think about, and it's a really sharp question, a really interesting discussion. We talked about this on the Inner Circle podcast. So we have a Tuesday podcast in Inner Circle that's not focused on the slate behind. It's not focused on the slate ahead. We just talk like macro DFS strategy. And somebody asked a question about a roster that Osimo had put in that was like, I think it was Derek Carr, Josh Jacobs, Devontae Adams, and Mac Hollins. And I, after, or maybe that was, no, he had a week where he won big with that. And somebody else had asked about a roster where he had 4 pieces from Miami and no bring back. And I've seen him play as many as 5 pieces from Miami in smaller field contests this year. And so again, background on Osimo, you know, one of the top DFS players, but he's like a math genius. And so it's this, these are the things why we study rosters, and what we can learn from other sharp players is how do we turn the math in our favor? So playing 4 guys from one team, it's almost certain that not all four of them will hit. But you basically look at it as you will get a block of points from those 4 players. Maybe only 3 of them hit, but you get this big block of points, and now you only have 5 things left to get right. So you're lowering your ceiling a little bit, but you're increasing your odds. You're turning the math more in your favor, which is all about what these smaller field contests are about. That said, actually, you know what? So I was going to say, that said, it's all about concentrated offenses. So like when Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow were out, the Raiders were so concentrated, right? It was like, that's why Jacobs or Adams scored 30 plus points every week. The Dolphins are so concentrated. It's Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And I think a lot of those Osmo rosters that went heavy on the Dolphins, it was like they were playing in the late game. And so it was like, he had the flexibility to move off of some of these pieces, but whatever position he was in after the early game, it was like, let's just stick with like 4 Dolphins pieces or 5 Dolphins pieces. So I was going to say that to say the Lions aren't as concentrated, but what's interesting is actually the only pass catchers who play 100% of the snaps or close to 100% are Chark and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So it's really DeAndre Swift who's not part of the concentration because he's in this backfield rotation, but Swift could still hit with them. So I wouldn't typically think of playing all 4 of them together. I would typically think of like 3 doing 3 one way or the other, but I think you could probably get away with it on this build in this week where there's a lot of uncertainty. There's only 2 teams implied to score more than 26 points. And then one of those, the team at 26 is the 49ers, who, again, they're not going to pass the ball more than like 25 times if they can help it. And then they'll probably be spelling Christian McCaffrey early to where he can't pay off his $9K price tag. So it's like, then you got the Packers who, you know, they spread the wealth mostly. Aaron Rodgers hasn't topped 250 passing yards this year, like 251 passing yards, right? So, and then they split their backfield work. And then you've got all these teams like 23 points or below. So basically the Lions, if they score 35, they could just be like the only offense that really matters, right? So this is a weird week in which in a small field contest, I wouldn't be against the idea of playing all 4 of them. You want to throw, I guess, do you have any questions on how I laid that out? Did that make sense? No. Then do you want to throw Amon-Ra St. Brown on here and just see what it would look like?
Yeah, let's do it. That made a lot of sense. I love it.
Okay. And I mean, yeah, still 7,100. We can literally do whatever we want. We could go Aaron Jones if we wanted to. You know, he was missed some practice time this week with, I think, it's a hip injury, but he practiced in full on Friday, and then he was removed from the injury report. No injury designation. So I would imagine that this was more of a thing where they're saying, look, these are must-win games for us, right? The Packers still have a shot at the playoffs. They have to win both games, get a little bit of help. And so it's like, let's rest him because if we can win these 2 games, then we also need him for the playoffs. So I would feel confident with Aaron Jones here, and that goes opposite our Dalvin Cook bet, where we're like, hey, Dalvin Cook getting the carries, Aaron Jones getting work through the air for the Packers and kind of this back and forth game. Or, you know, we could do something totally different here. We could shift up the salary structure. We could go up to Fields. We could move off of Swift. But yeah, any thoughts on how we want to use this last spot and kind of let that dictate what we do next?
I mean, so Tom Brady has a girlfriend now.
Does he really?
Yeah. I mean, maybe
so Tom Brady's getting laid. Tom Brady, sex Tom Brady is back in business. He's been celibate for months, and he's like, awful.
No, yeah, I totally like the Aaron Jones pick. We can definitely do that one.
Real quick, a note on the Mike Evans one. I was looking yesterday when I was leaving my notes on our cheat sheet ownership. He's projected at like 0.5% ownership, which there's not going to be many 30-pointers on this slate. And he's capable, like he hasn't done it for 2 months. He's had horrible games for 2 months, but he's capable of putting up 30 points. He's on a roster like this where we have so much high probability stuff locked in. This roster looks exactly like what I want my small field rosters to look like. So with this much high probability stuff locked in, this is not to say, hey, we should go play Mike Evans. This is just a note for anybody watching this and for you. Like this is the type of build where I would be like, you know what? I would throw Mike Evans on here and like take on that risk because of the ceiling and the chance that he could leap over everybody else. You know, like we know Miles Sanders has a broad range of outcomes, but on that big weekend I had a few weeks ago in small field play, I had Miles Sanders because he was low owned and can hit for these big games. So like on this roster, I say, let's go ahead and lock in Aaron Jones because we're 40 minutes in and this isn't like our, like, you know, we can still keep building in real life from here, but there's a lot of different ways I can mix and match things on this roster. And like I said, you could play around with moving off Amon-Ra St. Brown and then potentially going up to Justin Fields. You could move around with going off the Eagles defense, you know, and moving up Justin Fields. You could move off of DeAndre Swift to a different running back and then have the Chark Amon-Ra St. Brown move down from Aaron Jones. There's so many things that we could do with this roster, but I would basically keep the starting point of Goff, Dortch, Chark, Kittle, and Dalvin Cook, those first 5 pieces. And then I'm only playing one of those 3 defenses on tighter builds. And then I would be like, okay, I have these 5 pieces in place. There's like 50 different ways I can build these other pieces. And let me mix and match them and see what like sits best with me for this week's slate. And that's what I'm saying. This is the only five piece way to start things, but it's just a really sharp 5-piece way to start things. So we could have started with like a totally different 5-piece way that could be a foundation for us. But like, that's kind of how I do these smaller fields is I start with all these questions and then it's like, okay, here's a foundation I like. Let me keep mixing and matching pieces till I feel what's most comfortable. And then I might start, if I have enough time, I might start with a totally different foundation and then like start the whole process over again. And then I'd have like 4 different final builds that I can compare to each other with 4 different starting foundations. But this starting foundation that we had and like the conversation that brought us to this foundation, it's like a really sharp way to start a roster this week in small field play. And we filled in the other pieces in really sharp ways as well. But then there's a lot of different ways that we could do it that we kind of touched on. So yeah, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, I really like this build and I'm probably going to dupe it. That's
yeah, technically it's our build, so you're not even duping it, but I bet that everybody else will see a few of these in small field contest this week. Yeah, don't dupe us. Technically, these are experiments, but I think on one of our builds this year on the show with Pete, where it had like a monster weekend, people were sending him screenshots of the winnings that they'd gotten up for the roster. That is not the point of these, but I guess we can't stop you from doing that. Yeah, this is I love this. I love doing one of these small field ones. As always, Keegan, thanks for your time. Everybody watching this, thanks for hanging out. We will see you back here next week on Tuesday for the wacky and wild Week 18 slate. We will see you on OWS throughout the week, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.